Three, two, welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. I love talking to authors because they have the courage to take their thoughts, their stories, their lessons, put it down in a book and share it with the many, ultimately changing their legacy and destiny in the process. And if you're an entrepreneur out there who wants to wow their audience, I highly recommend you write a book. All right. And not only will you obtain clarity and self-awareness, you will obtain many opportunities. If you need help with any of that, check out dreamstarterspublishing.com. And let's say you have a book that's already done, you want to use it to generate leads for your business, check out bookmarketingcrm.com. Now, I use that word wow for a reason, because that pertains to our next guest. He wrote a book called Your Story Well Told: Creative Strategies to Develop and Perform Stories That Wow an Audience. And we have the author with us today, Corey Rosen. Thank you so much for being here, man. I really appreciate
Yep.
it.
Thank you. Thank you,
Rosen,
Mike.
Rosen.
Yeah.
Corey Rosen. I
It's all
apologize.
good. No worries. You're not the first to pronounce it that way. There's many a Rosen in the world walking around saying, "Why do you keep calling me Rosen?" So yes, I happen to be a Rosen.
Yeah, well,
But it
you
is
are the
so great to be
second.
here, and I just want to start out with some compliments for you. I think what you're doing is so great and so important, and I want to completely agree with the premise of what you just sort of laid out. This concept that as an entrepreneur, as an individual in business, whatever business you're in, putting your words into the world, putting a book out that kind of articulates who you are, what you do, how you think, is a beautiful thing and such a wonderful opportunity for you to get your message out into the world, build your own brand, kind of broadcast who you are and how you think to others. And it becomes this magnet where it sort of draws people to you to find out more about you and how you think and what you do. So as thought leaders, as business leaders, as individuals, as artists, whatever you are, publishing yourself is a beautiful investment of your time.
Damn
And I
right.
totally agree.
Damn right. I think that once I understood attraction marketing, it's really all about rather than chasing people, being the light, right? Being the example, almost the bug light effect, where you're
Yeah.
bringing people in. And I think the only way you do that is you do what other people want to do, right? And then some people buy the Lamborghini, some people live the lavish lifestyle, but some people just want to write a book. And if you write a book, you stand out. Some people want to do a podcast, and if you do a podcast, you stand out. So some people want to do podcast and walk on a treadmill at the same time, but no, most people just won't, because they don't have the discipline you do. And I'm impressed by this, man. So
That is
I
true.
love
For those who
individuals.
can't see this, people may be listening to this. I am walking on a treadmill at the same time, so I am doing
You're
double,
getting used.
triple duty right now.
Well, how great is that?
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs, we're so focused on getting the checklist off, checklist items done throughout the day. You become ultra efficient, and you start
Yeah.
to take all your entrepreneurial skills and apply it everywhere in your life. And that's what you're doing. So I'm
I
impressed, man.
think
But
so. I think so.
let's start off with the genesis of this book and maybe
Yeah.
the background on where you come from and what got you to this point.
Absolutely. So my life in a nutshell. So I started out in performing arts and in visual arts. I studied film at college at Northwestern University. I left there and went into the movie business. Worked for 12 years for George Lucas in the Industrial Light and Magic, which is his visual effects animation studio.
Wow.
Initially as an artist, like a visual effects artist, making Star Wars movies and other kind of movies that, sometimes you look at my IMDb and it's like, wow, those were terrible movies, but they had great visual effects. Like that's, I think, a lot of the early movies of sort of my career. But what I always kind of wanted to do was tell my own stories and kind of grow in that way. So initially at Lucasfilm and some other companies, I started sort of segueing into screenwriting. So wrote some original stories, some pitches, worked with Hollywood studios to develop original content. But I always kind of wanted to tell my own stories. And sort of coincidentally with the world and podcasts and radio shows, I discovered a organization called The Moth, which is a pretty well-known podcast, the Moth Podcast. It's also the Moth Radio Hour, which is on NPR stations all over the place. And the way that their stories are told are basically live events where people in cities all around the world get together. Their names are drawn out of the hat, and they tell a true story on stage. there are judges who judge those stories, and then basically they win if you know, are chosen as the top of those 10 stories. So I went to one of those shows, because I liked, I kind of put together these concepts as a storyteller and as a performer to say, I don't have to play other characters. I can be myself. So I got up on one of those stages. I told one of my stories. I won the show. And the weirdest thing was that it was the first time that that show had been done in my particular market. I live in San Francisco. And the producers of the show were like, hey, would you like to be the host of the show? So talk about right place at the right time. From that point forward, and that was now 11 years ago, I have now been the regular host of this very well-known show that's always sold out. We played a 400 to 2,000 person audiences in San Francisco. And the thing that I kind of gleaned from that experience, from both being a writer, a storyteller, a screenwriter, a performer, is and now a host, is listening to people tell their stories, just like you do. When you hear people tell their stories, you learn so much by listening. There's something to be said for learning by doing, but learning by listening, especially with stories, hearing other people tell their stories, how they tell their stories, and really understanding what makes an effective story became kind of my thing, my passion. And so the book that I wrote, which is called Your Story Well Told, articulates that. It sort of takes what we have inside of us, which, for I'll be honest, a lot of people are kind of afraid to do the thing, whatever the thing is. The thing might be writing the book, the thing might be making the podcast, the thing might be telling their story. And that fear prevents a lot of people from starting.
Mm.
So what the book does is it's a catalyst for that. It gets you started. It gets you ideating. It gets you thinking in creative ways to generate all of those stories that you have inside of you. You aren't just your origin story. You aren't just the big accident story. You aren't just the big success or the big failure. You're all of these little stories inside of you. And when you can articulate those effectively, you create connections with other people, and those connections create business, they create connection, they create relationships, and they create your path forward.
Man, being around people like George Lucas might just give you such an advantage in the marketplace in any business, right?
Sure.
Because master storytellers can capture an audience, whether it's in person or on a screen or on social media or on a podcast. And the ability to tell a story in any form is going to give you such an advantage wherever you go, on
So true.
dates, with your kids, wherever,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
It's true.
did you work?
And people like that. So I worked with Spielberg, I worked with Lucas, I worked with Ron Howard, like working with people who are well known, who are, sort of celebrated storytellers, understand a couple of basic things. And some of those things are, for example, telling a simple story, like really simplifying your story down to a core message. Something I like to tell people is every story that you tell shouldn't be every story. By that I mean,
Great
like,
point.
sometimes people will sort of tell one story, it will segue into another story, and you don't even know what story you're listening to anymore because they just kind of spiral off into tangents. But being clear, being concise, and having a message is powerful because you can really focus your audience's attention on what the telling, the teaching, the message, whatever that is in the statement that you're making.
Mm, it's great. And I'm assuming that you've seen a trend in the movies that have done really well. And just
Sure.
from an outsider's perspective, and knowing a little bit about Joseph Campbell and his analysis of the hero's journey, we are mostly drawn to the hero's journey in movies, right? In every
Sure.
story. What
Yeah.
what that means is there's an individual or a character that's sort of the outsider or potentially somebody who is the everyday man or woman. And they're in a familiar world, and they go from a familiar world into an unfamiliar world where it's full of danger and things that are scary, or this is where this individual's tested and they meet their allies and their mentors, but also their enemies. And then there's this ability to muster up the courage or the skill set to go into the cave, into the battle, and win. But it's not just the win that matters, it's what they've learned along the way. And then they have to go back to that ordinary world and give those viewpoints to the individuals that that they're familiar with, the tribe that they started off with. So the completion of the hero's journey matters to us because we can always envision ourselves going through the exact same thing, whether it's Rocky or whether it's The Hobbit or whether it's the Count of Monte Cristo. We put ourselves in those heroes' shoes, and that matters because
Mhm.
as a storyteller, what you really want to do is tell it in a way that inspires and motivates those around you, and applying the hero's journey in every aspect does that for you. So is there anything else you've learned that might kind of latch on to what I just said?
100%. So I am, yeah, big fan of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was Campbell's kind of seminal book, Joseph Campbell's book. But using sort of mythic structure in storytelling is something that is not out of the reach for our stories, for business stories, for sales stories, for case studies. Because just like you said, the way that a hero's journey is typically drawn, if you look at illustrations of it, it's a circle, it's not a straight line. So a lot of storytelling you think of in kind of like a linear fashion where you're going from a beginning to an end. And there's logic to that. Time moves forward, right? Time is linear in some way, and you go from a state of being to something, some normal state of your life to finding some catalyst for change. One of my favorite kind of trends in a hero's journey story for a Joseph Campbellian hero is what's called the call to adventure. So you get some kind of a job offer, you get some kind of an incentive, or somebody asks you or tells you or gives you an opportunity to do something. And the human instinct is to say, no, thanks. That's going to change everything. And change is scary, right? So it's called refusal of the call. It's where
Yes.
you are given an opportunity to do what you need, what you want, and you say, no, thank you. This is even evident in Star Wars, right? Uh, Luke Skywalker, he wants to be a pilot. He wants to go to the Space Academy. His uncle tells him, "Oh no, you have to work on the moisture farm on Tatooine another season. You can go next year. You can go next year." Oh, rats, right? Then these droids show up. They introduce him to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "You have to come with me and save the princess," right? That is the call to adventure in Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie. You have to come with me. And he goes, "Oh, I can't do that. I have to go back to the thing." This is everything this character wants is to go on an adventure. But he says, no, he goes back home. And what happens? The stormtroopers have come. They killed his family, burned down his house. He has nowhere to go back to. So the only place for him to go is forward.
Bingo.
And that's a hero's journey, sort of exaggerated version of this. But if you think about our own lives of crossing that threshold, how exciting slash scary that can feel to go to take the leap, to quit the job, to go into the business, to open the account, to do whatever you've got to do to be the self that you want to be. But what it throws you into is the adventure, is the
Chaos.
unknown world. So if you think about that circle illustration that we were talking about before, if the top of that circle is the beginning of the journey, about, not like maybe a third of the way down, you might draw a horizontal line across. And everything above that line is the known world. Everything below that line is the unknown world, the world of adventure, of danger, of the unknown. So most of your journey is going to take place in the unknown world. You're crossing that threshold into an unknown universe where you are going to have successes, you're going to have failures, and every step of the way, you're going to meet people, you're going to learn things, and it's going to get you closer to the goal that you are setting for yourself. And as you beautifully pointed out, getting to the goal, achieving the goal is not the end of the story. It's usually sort of the middle of the story because now I've got the thing I wanted. What am I going to do with it? How am I going to use this information, use this contact, use this wisdom that I've gained? I have to get it back to where I was. I have to create a new normal. And
Yes.
that's why it's a circle. You go all the way back, in a sense, to the normal everyday. Now I am different. How am I going to use this in the future?
Bingo.
Yeah.
And when it comes to being able to craft that consistently, coherently, and efficiently, I think it just takes practice, right? And like you said before, that many people don't start until they feel like they're ready. Well, newsflash, you're never going to be ready. And
Yeah.
I've been speaking on stage for years now, and I will tell you that I am way, way better than whenever I first started, but I am still so far from where I want to be. It is
Yeah.
insane. And as time goes on, I become a little bit more articulate, a little bit more exciting, a little bit more interesting. And repetition to me is part of it, but also there has to be a transformation. You have to see a difference from one speech to another, from where you were 5 years ago. You better be in a little bit more of a professional state. You better
Mhm.
have a little bit more, I guess, maturity to you, right? There's got to be a transformation, not only for you to be more confident on stage, but for the marketplace to see the growth. So repetition, but also constant transformation is
Yeah.
what I recommend. And the only way that you transform, in my opinion, is constant action. Action creates traction. Write more
Yeah.
books, create more content, work with more
Yeah.
people, put yourself in more situations, slay more dragons, get beat up, get punched in the face, learn new skill sets, and then apply accordingly. So, where
It's
would you
true. If
start?
you,
That's my
yeah, if you,
recommendation. What
I
would
agree.
what do you,
If
yeah,
you do the same thing, you will have no change, right? And that
right.
is a place of safety, right? And so, in the world of improvisational theater, there's this concept of what people know as the yes and mindset and the yes but or the no because mindset. We have lots of reasons to say no to things in our world. No is not a bad word. No is the path to safety, to protection, to the status quo. Like if I don't want change, keep saying no and nothing will change and it'll be just the way that it is. Yes is a scary word because when you say yes to something, that means that you're committing and you're moving forward.
Yes.
So, from the perspective that you were talking about in terms of putting yourself out there, absolutely. Like doing the reps, getting on stages, bombing, failing,
Bombing.
doing a
Yes.
bad job
Did it.
will make you better, right? It's like you look at stand-up comics who are rocking this world and touring and playing, giant stadiums. They were doing open mics 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Like they were getting in the hours, they were trying their material. Even people like Chris Rock will go to little comedy clubs, get up for half an hour and bomb because he's trying out material that he knows he wants to be solid so he can get to the big stages. He is not fun. If you've known anybody who's ever seen Chris Rock in a little club, they will tell you, oh, yeah, yeah, he was not funny because he's not being Chris Rock there. He's being a comedy writer, he's developing material. I want to just throw one other thing that you mentioned before that I think would be helpful for people thinking about. We're talking about storytelling and slaying dragons and big concepts, but not all of our stories involve things as dramatic as that.
Right.
So you go, how do I still have a compelling story that doesn't involve, say, giant stakes or things like that? Maybe it's just about making the sale or landing the client or writing the book or doing something that, relatively speaking, might seem smaller. And one way I like to kind of distill down this hero's journey we talked about is using a simplified version of that that's called the story spine. And it was developed by someone named Ken Adams. And it breaks it down in like 7 or 8 sentences. And it's like once upon a time, every day, until one day, and because of that, because of that, and because of that, until finally, and ever since that day. Right. So that's like 8 seed sentences. And so you're just breaking your story down into those things. So once upon a time, what's where, when, who is happening every day, what's normal in this world until one day something changed, right? And because of that, you did something or said something. And because of that, something else happened. These are successes, failures, what have you, until finally some final thing happened. The client converted, the sale landed, the company folded, whatever the changes. And ever since that day is the new normal. So for people looking at their own lives, trying to say, how do I make a story out of my life? Look at those 2 pieces of the story spine. Look at the ever since that day. How are things now? And can you draw a line, like an arc back to every day? So what was it like? And what is it like now? And then you can find those until one day. It's like, what was the thing that set you in motion to get there? Because at the end of the day, anything can be a story or feel like a story as long as it has one of 2 things. One is change, right? Something is different at the end than it was at the beginning. Like that is a definition of a story. Like there is something different. Another definition of a story is if nothing has changed, how have you changed, right? Like what is your perspective on this absence of change, that your mindset can change even if the world didn't change, nothing else changed, but you got out of there, or you moved on, you grew, whatever your change was, um, signifies to your listener a lesson, a teaching,
Hmm.
a story.
Now, one thing I was about to do this past, I guess you a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, I was about to join, but I started to take up another, I guess you could say, not a hobby, but another craft. I got into jujitsu, okay, and so I was going to start to train myself in a different way and learn a skill set that I've definitely been weak at for many years. But I was about to get into improv and doing stand up, not just because I want to get into becoming a better comedian, but really I want to become better at telling stories on stage. And I
Yeah,
think comedians are the best at it, right?
yeah,
It
yeah,
is one of the hardest skill sets out there. And like you said, Chris Rock probably testing things out, even though he's hilarious. When he tries a new joke out and he's finding his rhythm, I guarantee he bombs many times. Jerry
all the time.
Seinfeld even agreed to this that, he'll go to certain clubs, test things out, and he's not funny. He knows it. And he's trying to figure out what works, what doesn't. And then whenever he has his special, it's
Yeah,
probably many weeks or months boiled down to 45 minutes. So,
yeah, yeah.
improv exercises to stimulate creativity without feeling foolish are explained in your book. Can you give us
Yes.
one, two, or three that you could share?
Absolutely. So, improvisation sort of has a little bit of a bad reputation. I want to say a lot of people think of improv as like, oh, I've got to be funny, I've got to be a performer, I got to be a comedian. And the truth is something closer to what you just said, Mike, which is that improvisation is what we're doing all the time. We're improvising right now. We don't
Yeah.
know what's going to happen next, what you're going to say next. It is actually the act of being present, of training yourself to plan what you're going to say, but to be willing to throw that plan away and be in the moment and adapt to what is happening. So, anytime you take an improv workshop or an improv class, no matter where it is, who it's taught by, what you're actually doing is you're doing neuroscientific brain training. You're training your mind to accept failure, to be nimble, to be collaborative, to listen to other people's ideas and use their ideas and work together with other people. I can't think of better business skills than those things. Accepting failure, learning from failure, being collaborative, listening to other people's ideas, and allowing yourself to be changed. So there's a number of activities and games that I teach in the book that kind of build on that. And one of them uses this idea that we were just talking about, this concept of yes and, but using it when giving a feedback to somebody else.
Mm.
So if you're giving an employee or a colleague some notes or some feedback on something, this is the concept that, to be honest, nobody likes this process. Nobody looks forward to, like, hey, I'd like to give you some notes on that, Mike. Like, part of you is going to tense up, is going to worry about it, is going to fear the worst, right? So what do? We kind of shut down, we close our ears, we don't want to hear it. We kind of wait it out, or we fight back. We're ready to put up our dukes and tell you that you're wrong. I don't want that idea. We're going to fight back and make it contentious. This is what an improviser would do. Two things. First, instead of telling you everything that's wrong with your idea, they're going to start with what's working. Like, this is something that I like about what you're doing. This is something that I noticed, that I observe, that I'm acknowledging, that I'm appreciating about what you're doing. And then I'm going to and it. I'm going to suggest something. I'd be curious to see what would happen if you would do it this way. I was wondering if you would try integrating this other idea that I had into your flow. So rather than being pushing back and saying no to you and pushing you back against the wall, I'm building up something that you're doing well and I'm adding something to it. So you're creating a collaboration.
Mm.
The other concept that I have in the book, which is more about receiving feedback. So if basically using yes and as a way of giving feedback to someone else, and this applies, of course, to storytelling, but also to general communication, is when receiving feedback. You mentioned that you're studying jujitsu. Have you ever studied Aikido in any
N-
way?
No, I've watched the videos and
Yeah.
it's a lot. There's many things that are similar, but it's more
Yeah.
about throwing rather than to take people to the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's true, because if you think about Aikido as a philosophy more than a physicality, it's the same kind of thing. If you try to block an attacker or somebody's energy coming at you, um, you're you're going to take all of their abuse. They're going to beat on you, and you may be protected, but you're not going to be well off, and you're not going to win that engagement. Same thing. If you try to fight back against them, maybe the two of you are going to be beat up, and you're going to be scrappy, and you're going to get a couple of licks in, but they're going to get a couple of licks in. But again, you're not going to be changed or improved. So the Aikido way is to blend energies, to essentially turn your perspective and look at it from their perspective. Use their energy
against them.
against them in some way. And I'm not saying that this is to be contentious, but from an Aikido standpoint, when someone is giving me feedback, what I try to do is I try to look at it from their perspective. Say, oh, I could try that. I might do that. Thank you for, maybe I'll just write it down. Thank you for that feedback. By just internalizing somebody's energy, ideas, or criticism, whatever that is, I'm not fighting them. I'm using it. I'm yes-anding it. And together we can find our way to a better place.
Mm. Yeah, and so whenever you put this book together, it definitely
Yeah.
comes off as this could be relatable to anybody who gets on stage or on a podcast because it's a natural conversation. It's also you're up on stage and you are attracting and wowing this audience. But like
Yeah.
you said, this is great for the one-on-one consultation. This is great within your team, right?
Yeah.
And and I guess the more you understand just maybe collaboration in general, you become a better listener, more
Hmm.
so than a better speaker, even. And
Yeah.
I like how you said that is the greatest listeners usually become great communicators. And so
That's totally true.
part of wowing an audience is listening to them, right? Paying attention to them. Also, giving them some type of, I don't know, if you want to say acknowledgement that you see them and hear them. So, the greatest speakers that I know of, they look at the audience, and if they see something, they don't ignore it, they call it out. Or
Yeah.
they also, I don't know, it feels like it's a one-on-one conversation than a one to many. And is that
Yep.
part of the equation?
I think so. I think everybody at heart wants to feel safe, wants to feel supported, wants to feel listened to. So as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, as team members, as part of a larger organization or our own organizations, remembering that everybody wants to be heard, seen, and listened to builds morale, builds connection, builds communication. So here's an example of something that I might suggest in normal everyday life. We have meetings all the time, right? People will have conferences, whether they're virtual on Zoom or in person or on a conference table. And there's an agenda, and we have only so much time, and we're going to spend this time. And, maybe the person running the meeting is going to sit there and talk to eight other people, right?
Yep.
And sometimes that's not the best use of people's time, right? Sometimes you try to look at, like, well, what is happening here? Who is in this room? What are the powers of these people? And this might seem silly, so just go with me for this. But sometimes starting out a meeting like that with 2 minutes or 1 minute of a game or an activity that, like, we're just going to be stupid for a minute. And maybe it's not out publicly to everybody and like looking silly in front of your colleagues. Maybe it's just like one-on-one. You're going to turn to somebody next to them and you're going to like play an improv game, right? You're going to there's a game that I love called gift giving, where like I give you a gift, pretend gift. And whatever it is, I can say like, hey, Mike, here's I'm holding up my hand right now. I'm like, here's a brick, right? No matter what it is, you have to say, that's exactly what I wanted, and then tell me why. So, Mike, here's a brick. Why is that exactly what? Say that's exactly what I wanted.
That's exactly what I wanted because I was actually building a shed for my dog that I was about to buy, and I need that exact brick. Thanks so much.
Yeah. And now you pick something from your pile or whatever, and
Yeah.
whatever it is, it's exactly what I wanted.
Oh my God, you see this right here? This right here, this gold pen
That
is
It's a gold pen. This is exactly what I wanted. I have so many autographs to sign. And I like to feel very, royal and regal when I do so. So thank you. This is exactly what I wanted. Right. So we would just go back and forth for, a minute and do that. And what's happening? Nothing to some degree, right? We're just goofing around. But also, what are we doing? We're making each other laugh. We're feeling present. We're connecting. We're enjoying each other's company. And now, okay, let's get to the business of the meeting. And what's happened is like in a really interesting psychological and literal physiological way too, is that everybody that's come into this meeting now had something on their mind from before, wherever they were coming from, wherever they're going to next. But what it's done is back to what my book is kind of about, is being present. If we're now here because we've had to goof around and react to your gold pen and my brick, so now for this moment, we're paying attention, and that's going to be a more effective meeting.
Mm, got it. And what you just did there is you got people to think with excitement, right? To have fun with it.
Yeah.
And there's people who are in that state of mind, very much like Tony Robbins always says, when you are in a state of mind and you're active, you are going to retain more. And
Yeah.
so you are not only going to retain more, but you're more involved in the conversation. So it's like it's like you flipped a switch. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've got to read the room. Sometimes people are not feeling it. Something's going on and people aren't feeling goofy, playful. Like, I'm not saying do this every time. Otherwise, people will find reasons not to come to the meeting because they're like, oh, I don't want to play a dumb game. Like, it's not about forcing fun. I think that that's a misnomer when it comes to some kinds of improvisation, is that it's going to be somehow forced on you. What I guess I'm more interested in, and this relates also back to storytelling and telling good stories, is creating connections. So, whatever that is, and this is why, let's go back to being a speaker. So, if you're a public speaker and you're doing a pitch to a conference room, or you're doing a keynote to a giant, amphitheater, wherever that is, one of the first things that I like to do as a speaker is walk the room. I want to talk to one or two people. I want to essentially feel like, what's going on here? Who are the people that I'm going to be talking to? Other people I know kind of go back to the green room and they rehearse their speech and they're kind of siloed and they're thinking about what they're going to say. The reason that I do what I do of being in the room is that I then feel like I'm somehow vibing with them. I'm syncing my
Yep.
energy to theirs. I know what's going on. Maybe everybody's frustrated because there was really bad traffic or really hot weather, and that's what's on people's minds. In some way, if when I'm starting or somewhere in my presentation, I acknowledge that, I'm going to get a reaction from people. They're going to feel like I understand. I'm not just pushing my message, but I'm connected with them. And then when I push my message, it's more likely to be heard and seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just basically
I'm
like
with you.
walk the room,
That's
look at
that's
people, connect with people. Go ahead.
yeah, that's sort of my strategy too, is like you get to feel what they're feeling. And if you are, like you said, pushing your message and your message alone, I think you lose the audience. So I'm glad you brought
Yeah.
that up. I just want to
Yeah.
touch on that. That's good.
Super true. So yeah, so being among them, connecting with them, also from a, I guess from a presence standpoint too, where you look, how you present yourself publicly has a big impact too. I think there is a lot of people who get a little stage fright, they get a little nervous, they get a little queasy, little butterflies, and they'll either read from their notes or they'll sort of stare off into space and have kind of like blank, no expression. Well, all of these impact us and the message that you're making. So something that I strongly suggest, and this might, of course, not work for everybody, but I'm going to just sort of say my piece because it's my philosophy, is I think it's really important to have a plan and to be willing, just like in any kind of improvisation, to throw the plan away. In other words, to go off of that plan, to speak from the heart, to speak truthfully, and to maybe diverge from what's on the script that you've written that's on the screen in front of you, relax or relate to it and refer to it, but don't feel that you need to read every single word exactly that it is there, because people can tell when you feel like you're speaking to us and telling us a story. Think about like a dinner party. Nobody's pulling out notes and reading a story about something that just happened. They're going to tell you what happened, right? So a presentation can feel like that too. It can feel like you are reacting to me, you are telling me this story. And it's also, back to stand up, one of kind of the great tricks that good stand-ups pull, which is it feels like they're just thinking of this stuff, right? They're like, "Hey, you ever notice this?" They're riffing, but in actuality, they're very practiced and they know exactly what Jerry Seinfeld is going to be saying. But when you hear him say it, it almost sounds like he's saying it or thinking it for the first time. So I think as a presenter, think like that. Think like, how can I be more relaxed? How can I be more casual and more believable? Because that kind of vulnerability builds credibility, and credibility is more valuable than sometimes the message that you're making. Because if I believe you, then I believe you.
Yeah. Yeah, how you say something is just as important or maybe even more important than what you say. It's a great
Yeah.
way to say it. So
Yeah.
significant that piece of advice. And when it comes to storytelling in general, I've heard a few people elaborate on some things that you should look out for or what you should focus on, and I would love to hear your viewpoints on it. But what whenever you hear a great storyteller, what is it about them? Is it the fact that
Mm.
they're great at misdirection? They add humor to it. Um, you don't know where they're going. They focus on a story that gets our brains to think in a certain way, and you're not looking like an educator or a teacher, but
Mm.
really an entertainer. Like, what is it about great storytellers that really makes us think of them as significant people in our lives?
That is such a great question. The truth is, there is not one way to tell a story. So there are some people that kind of pitch like, use this structure. This is the successful way to tell a story. I believe that the best way to tell a story, the best way for you to tell your story is to tell a story like you. The credibility that you will build and earn from being authentic to yourself is is a simplified way of doing that. But if that doesn't work for you, I'm going to give you an actual step-by-step plan to make your stories better. And this is adapted. I will credit my source for this, but this is adapted from Dan and Chip Heath's book Made to Stick, which, I'm sure you've read and your
No,
listeners
I
have.
haven't.
You
I
haven't.
wish I could say I
Oh,
have, but I'm putting
yeah.
that down on the list.
Yes, Made to Stick, Dan and Chip Heath. Big fan. It's a marketing book. It's about why certain stories, certain companies, certain messages are sticky, why they land, why they connect with audiences. I've applied their system to storytelling, and it basically breaks down to the letters that spell success. So this is how to tell a better story. Look at your own story and think, like we started with, is it simple? S, right? Am I saying one thing, or am I saying a very complicated message that should be distilled down to the core of what I'm saying is this? You is universal, right? Even if this is a personal story or a business story, can anybody relate to this story? Maybe it's about some value. Maybe it's about succeeding when I didn't think I could succeed, or maybe it's about um, growing from failure, or whatever that is. So, is there something universal that anybody can grasp onto? The two C's are concrete and credible, right? Concrete. Am I putting details in my stories? Am I filling them with descriptions and ways that people are not just hearing the bullet points, but visualizing the story, putting some imagery or sort of like a movie in their mind? Can they see the story as I'm laying it out? And credibility, we just talked about in terms of like your believability, which could come out of the details or it could come out of you, how you present your story. E, any guesses of what the E might be in this success thing?
I'm gonna say entertaining.
That's a good one. That's a good one. It's related to entertainment, but it's emotion.
Okay.
Emotion. So entertainment might be one of your emotions, right? Is it entertaining? Is it funny? Or are you relating to your audience how you felt, how it was for you? It's not just about what happened, but how it was. That's very connecting for an audience or a listener to not just say what happened, but how you responded, reacted, or how the characters or people in it responded to things. Because we can, as humans, we can relate to that. And then the final two S's are surprise, right? Did something surprising happen that I might remember that as unusual in some way or
And that's
unexpected?
sort of the misdirection. You're not expecting it
Yes.
whatsoever. Okay, good
Yep.
deal. That
So misdirection is surprise. And people sometimes will remember, like, remember that twist, remember that odd thing, remember that detail. And sometimes that's all it takes. The misdirection, the twist, the surprise is enough for us to remember you, remember your story. And that's the last S is story. Are you telling a story? Does it have an arc, a beginning, middle, end? Is there a every day? Is there an ever since that day?
hmm. So remember. the acronym success.
Success.
When
Yes.
you're putting together that speech or that presentation
Yeah.
or even that book, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily the best system to use when trying to cook up the idea, but once you've got a basic story, it's a really good system to calibrate that story, to adjust things, to tune it, to look at like how can I be more emotion, where can I bring emotion in? How can it be more concrete? How can I build credibility? Is it universal enough? Is it simple? You can kind of look at that matrix and adjust the story that you're telling to really drive impact to your audience.
Mm. Any bits of information that you could provide our audience? As I said before, probably most people who work with us or listen to this podcast either have a book or are looking to write a book. Any piece of advice to write a chapter? And I'm
Sure.
reading some of your book and I'm looking at how funny some of the opening lines are. And
Yeah,
one of which is you getting punched by another kid's mom, I think is in chapter one. That's hilarious the
true.
way it started off. But uh, that to me, you're hitting the reader with a surprise and something funny. Then it's also it's not dry. It's not something that they've read before. It seems
Yeah.
like this is fresh. This is you. So, any advice that you can give us?
So your listeners are intelligent, successful, smart people.
Super good looking, rich,
Of course,
famous.
yes, yes,
Yeah, right.
generous, thoughtful, and tender lovers. No,
Right.
your audience is full, in other words, of stories. You have also information to put in your books. I would say we also want to hear your stories. So don't deprive us of examples of how you did that, how you distilled that as a lead in. So the example you gave, I got punched in the face dropping my kids off at school by another kid's mother, right? And that is the genesis into a story. Now, I could have started that story by talking about, so it's the morning and my kids were getting ready for school and we got in the car. Like I could bore you into not even wanting to read that story. But what I did there is I started in the action. I started with the hook of that story, which is a great technique for storytellers. It's called in media res, which is Latin for basically starting in the middle. So not starting with the whole on ramp of getting to who you are and what's going on. I talked about the story spine before about the once upon a time I lived here and my kids were this age and I would do every day I would drive them to school. No, let's start this story in the middle of the story with what happened. I got punched in the face. By doing that, what I hope to have done for you and other people that read my book is create curiosity. Like, why did you get punched in the face? Who the hell would punch you? What was going on? So I've grabbed your attention with that. And then this is how sort of in media res works. I start with that, and then I rewind the timeline back to my life and my children and my rituals and my routines, because somewhere in your head, you are knowing slash expecting we better get to that point where you get punched in the face so that when we do catch up to that, now you remember, oh yeah, this is why you got punched in the face. This is the lead up. So you know it's going to happen, but you don't know exactly how or where or when. So what you do with that kind of storytelling structure, and I've got a number of different, that's only one kind of structure that I've got in my book, which is different ways for you to tell stories that connect with you.
Mm.
There's another that I really like, which is called the petal structure, which is if you've got like, I don't have one big story, but I've got a couple of little examples, like a couple of examples of things that have happened. And imagine them like petals around like the center of a flower. And each little example is a story, but then you've got another little example, another little example. And what's in the middle of the flower is the thing that holds them all together, the message, the core, the teaching. So each of these little petals, and I'll give you an example of that. I have a student who had a story about these terrible roommates that she was living with. She had this awful roommate who they didn't get along at all. They had arguments all the time. Roommate moves out. She gets another roommate, just as bad. Terrible. She's got specific examples that I won't go into here, but example of terrible roommate after terrible roommate after terrible roommate. And then she goes, I don't know where to end this story. I don't know where to go with this. All I have is these experiences. So I started talking to her about with his roommates, about the situations. And they started talking about her. Like, how are you as a roommate? And it kind of emerged that she is a terrible roommate. She is not an easy person to live with. And then I asked her, well, who do you live with now? She goes, I live alone. And I said, and how's that working? She goes, it's great. I go, that's the end of your story. I have all these terrible roommates. And what I learned is I'm a terrible roommate. I'm a difficult person to live with. And so there, that gave us a simple story structure, a surprise element to it, some concrete examples that would be in there, a lot of credibility because she's being very vulnerable and humble about what's happening. And in the end, she had a really powerful and hilarious story that was created in that sort of pedal structure of smaller stories that all resonated with one central core theme.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that I've learned something from following people on social media that I love looking at their social media content because it's not just win after win after win after win. They do post their losses, and their
Yeah.
losses, the way they do it, are very funny, the way they
Yeah.
put it out there. And some people are so afraid to show their losses or whenever things are not in their favor, it doesn't draw the curiosity, right?
Yeah.
I want to see somebody's journey. And if somebody has the ability to showcase when things don't go right,
Yeah.
I look at them as real humans,
Yeah.
and that's more inspiring than anything else.
It's true.
Man, that's great stuff. I could talk to you for hours. Corey, is there a website or a social media channel that you're quite active that people could reach out to you or maybe find more information about you?
Absolutely. So my name is Corey Rosen, Coreyrosen, and my website is coreyrosen.com. You can also follow me at Story Rosen on social media.
Story Rosen. And
Yes.
is that on TikTok and Instagram, potentially even
TikTok,
Facebook?
Instagram, Facebook,
Story Rosen,
all
right?
the places. Yeah.
And so do you help people craft their story, maybe get
I
better
do.
at speaking on stage?
Yeah, I work with individuals,
Oh,
executives, and companies to help them and build their sales marketing teams or their own presentations to just be more effective. So I do that by listening, by talking, and by helping people tell their stories. Um,
it's
yeah,
great. Man, yeah. Got to come back on. I think
love
that a
it.
lot of people will are gonna resonate with this podcast, and it'd be an awesome experience to have you come back on. We could improv more and more, and have some fun and tell some better stories, and get my audience to know what you're all about because I like what you're saying, and I think you've helped me out quite a bit on this show. So I appreciate you coming on, guys. The
Thank
book is
you.
called Your Story Well Told: Creative Strategies to Develop and Perform Stories That Wow an Audience. Corey Rosen, thank you so much for being here, man.
Thank you.
Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.